I'd like to begin with something like a wager, namely that any new beginnings that have the potential to arise from the polycrisis that this conference takes as its theme must themselves begin with an active and systematic recognition of our shared finitude. This is probably banal and unoriginal enough as far as it goes as a bare wager. Finitude, of course, is after all such a well-worn and pervasive theme of 20th century European philosophy as it takes up and transforms the multiple legacies of Kant and the post-Kantian tradition into phenomenology and after. But finitude is also no doubt a recurrent motif of the early 21st century as we face the challenges of climate change, the destruction of natural environments, the global inequalities of wealth distribution and production, political and geopolitical oppositions and conflicts. Resources are finite, so we believe. Ecosystems have defined yet highly vulnerable limits. Growth is also necessarily finite, or should necessarily be thought of as such, although the emergence of the degrowth movement notwithstanding, we are clearly nowhere near rising to that particular challenge. And this, I guess, is the point, or the imperative of my bare, banal wager, namely the claim that we are nowhere near having begun to integrate in any unified or systematic manner the reality of finitude into our collective ways of being, our political and economic discourses and worldly forms, the behaviours of state and non-state actors, the relations or interactions between those actors, and to varying degrees into our everyday lives and patterns of consumption. Perhaps this is a matter for specialists of politics and economics, business and international relations, for legal and juridical theorists, and for non-academic institutions and organisations, both state and non-state based. Certainly, since the 1970s, the degrowth movement in economic theory has been subject of much controversy and debate across the board, all of which appears to be ongoing. Philosophy, of course, has persistently had its say, no doubt on the basis that if the fundamental orientations of philosophy have to some greater or lesser extent conditioned the historical processes and practices that have brought us to the point of polycrisis, then no doubt philosophy, in reforming and renewing its ontological and metaphysical assumptions, can somehow also condition and give legitimacy to better ways of collective being and doing. The last decades of the 20th and the initial 2 decades of the 21st century have seen a proliferation of novel ontological and metaphysical discourse, of which no doubt many of us will be aware. This proliferation of new ontologies and of reconfigured metaphysical forms might, it is thought, or at least implied, somehow help to save us, put us on the right track towards solutions or other better, more helpful ways of living and relating, and towards the avoidance of catastrophe. If Descartes, in an inaugural moment of technological modernity, when he imagined humans to be masters and possessors of nature, if then he was really so decisively influential, then perhaps our philosophical imaginary now, in the wake of modernity's spent utopias, can also make a difference. Out of the European tradition, we have imagined new and vital materialisms, neo-Spinozist reinventions, variations on speculative realism that seek an abandonment of finitude, all a proliferation of newly invented ontologies, all called upon to reform metaphysics, perhaps, somehow, and help reorientate human life and its place within the wider scheme of the living. For my own part, I've spent many years tarrying with the multiple legacies of deconstruction, the legacy of Derridian thought, but also its transformation in the work of his close colleagues and students, Jean-Luc Nancy, Catherine Malabou, and Bernard Stiegler. All three, albeit in different ways and with very different gestures, maintain Derrida's deconstructive posture in relation to ontology and metaphysics. I've been particularly engaged with Jean-Luc Nancy's thinking of sense and world, of being in the singular plural, a discourse which is not really an ontology as such, since it places the dissemination and sharing of worldly sense in excess of all discourse and logos. The Nancian sense of the world is always exscribed by the language that inscribes it. It is perhaps, as Derrida would say, at best or at worst, depending on your point of view, a quasi-transcendental ontologization of worldly sense. If it's an ontology at all, it's a deconstructed ontology, a finite thinking that enacts its ungraspable, groundless finitude. In this enactment, it also affirms the dispersion of worldly sense existence as shared. Existence here in excess of any logos or ontological disclosure is, for Nancy, always a coexistence, a sharing of finitude. In this way, Nancy's finite thinking occupies a singular position in relation to the recent proliferation of new ontologies and metaphysical discourses. In understanding the sense of the world as coexistence, he appears to preempt by at least 2 decades the recent ontological turn, whilst at the same time maintaining a deconstructive posture vis-à-vis ontology as such. At the same time, this deconstructive posture dictates a very specific orientation of Nancian thought in relation to the political, and more specifically, his manner of framing the relationship between philosophy and the political. Nancy's thinking of community as developed in the early 1980s, and specifically his thinking of community as inoperative, is predicated on an interruption of the passage between philosophical or metaphysical foundationalism and the invention, instantiation, and accomplishment of political forms. If Nancy's discourse on coexistence and shared finitude is not an ontology, or is at best only a quasi-transcendental ontologization, then it cannot circumscribe being or secure any foundation or ground for being as such. It is for this reason that community emerges in his work as inoperative. It is not a community that can be experienced, affirmed, constructed, or put to work in the grounding of a communal logos, mythos, or identitarian form, or indeed any shared understanding of what it is to be a human who philosophizes. Shared finite existence as inoperative community is, Nancy writes in a short text of 2014, in excess of all politics, ecclesiology, nationalism or communitarianism, as well as all types of solidarity, mutual assistance or collective care. To move from philosophy to politics or to the imagining of political forms is, for Nancy, always a problematic and eminently metaphysical gesture, one which seeks to found political community in a closed, totalizing, and potentially violent manner. And this is the lesson he takes from 20th century state forms, such as fascism, Nazism, or communist totalitarianism. But it is one that he extends to the relation between philosophy and politics as such. The former cannot, should not, try to give a foundation for the forms and imaginaries of the latter. So not only does Nancy maintain a deconstructive distance from ontology, he would also affirm that philosophical, ontological, and metaphysical discourse is dangerous if it tries to found a politics. Philosophy and reformed ontologies, or forms of metaphysics, cannot, after all, if we follow Nancy's thinking of finitude rigorously, save us. If there is to be a new beginning arising from the polycrisis, we should not be calling upon the aid of any reformed philosophical ontology or metaphysics in the hope of contributing to a reorientation of human life and its place within the wider scheme of the living. This might imply then that whatever new beginnings may be possible, it will be a matter for a political pragmatics in the pursuit of new possibilities, rather than for gestures of fundamental thinking or the revision thereof. It might be a matter for regional disciplines, forms, and dispersed actors who would conjoin somehow in a collective effort of new beginning without the need for a program founded in a philosophical logos or metaphysical mythos. And yet, and this is decisive, the lesson of deconstruction has perhaps always also been that reasonable disciplines, forms, and decisional agency have historically been inseparable from the kind of foundational metaphysical assumptions deconstruction itself seeks to deconstruct. In any case, how would something like a conjoined or collective effort to begin anew take form without at least some reference to a schema of fundamental values or imperatives, one that would give it some kind of efficacy or legitimacy? This, I think, is the double bind that Nancy's particular form of deconstruction, and arguably the legacy of deconstruction as such, has bequeathed to us today. On the one hand, philosophical foundationalism is dangerous and a condition of historical violence. On the other, we know that political possibilities are impossible to fulfill or accomplish without some reference to a schema of value that would allow them to take form and be enacted in the world. The outcome here is that if one does make a wager that new beginnings require a systematic recognition and affirmation of finitude, these beginnings must themselves take as their starting point the limitations imposed by finite thinking. So if one makes this wager, as I'm doing, on the affirmation of finitude, how is one supposed to take responsibility for the world and its future, and for the kind of political forms that this future may yield? In a text published shortly before his death, entitled The Fragile Skin of the World, Nancy speaks both of the future and of the present, arguing that in the absence of any transcendent historical telos or schema which would offer a guiding principle for history, with a capital H, we may only have the present as an experience from which to begin. Only the present, then, and its uncertain opening onto a radically unknowable future. But if this is a present that is somehow obscurely pregnant with the past and opens onto an entirely undecidable future, it is also one that is therefore without identity, and as present, it thus refuses or negates all presentism, understood as a bias to what we think we know or understand of the present moment and its attitudes and perspectives. What we need to do now, in this time after historical time, Nancy affirms, is to receive the gift of this present as allogenic to time. The present as something that originates from an elsewhere, a site that is other than the presence of the present. Receiving the gift of the present as allogenic to time necessitates a cultivation of a different kind of future that arises from this elsewhere of the present. A future which is not linked to a determinate past, nor to a knowable future, but which surges as a future of the approach and the occurrence of an unknown, from whose emergence neither the past nor the future can save us. We need, Nancy suggests, citing Clarice Lispector, to come to terms, and this is a key term for me, the creative unconscious of the world. This, elsewhere then, is still nothing other than a worldly affair, even if it is, as the world's unconscious, somehow anterior to the manifestation of the world or worlds we experience as such. What is at stake here, Nancy insists, is not a matter for ontology or metaphysics, nor for philosophical discourse as such. It's a question, in fact, of that which exceeds all metaphysics. Moreover, he argues, this is not an easy thought, and it is not a thought at all. It's a praxis, an ethos, a lived and living disposition with which, in one sense, we are already familiar without even knowing. This leads us inevitably to the question of just what such a praxis, such an ethos, might actually entail. If it's a lived disposition standing outside of the discourses of ontology or metaphysics, and therefore in excess of philosophy as such, then where does it stand? How can it be specified? How might we relate to such a praxis and an ethos how might we relate such a praxis and an ethos to the possibilities of new beginning in the time of polycrisis? How can such a praxis and ethos relate to something like a political form or practice of politics without invoking, one way or another, philosophical foundations? I want to leave Nancy now and the terrain of philosophical reflection and step out into the domain of semiotics, anthropology, and systems theory through the work of Juri Lotman and Gregory Bateson. I want to read the conceptual frameworks of Lotman's semiosphere and Bateson's reformulation of the term biosphere after Vernadsky alongside Nancy's finite thinking. This will be perhaps an example of what Bateson will call double or multiple description, where the formal characteristics of different forms are shown to be mirrored in each other. The aim here, through setting Lotman's semiosphere and Bateson's biosphere alongside each other, is to specify more precisely what we might come to understand by the creative unconscious of the world, the excess of worldly coexistence, and to specify in the most minimal terms also the praxis, the ethos, and the living disposition with which Nancy suggests we may somehow already be, as it were, pre-philosophically familiar. In this way, the praxis, ethos, and disposition that is at play here will be related to the name of bio-community. So, Gregory Bateson was not a philosopher, working initially in anthropology and then passing somewhat eclectically through social science, psychiatry, linguistics, biology, and evolutionary theory, inventing concepts along the way and borrowing others in a piecemeal manner from various philosophers and psychologists, say from, amongst others, Kant, Russell, and Jung, and blending them with insights drawn from systems theory, cybernetics, and semiotics. Arguably, his starting point was always the systems and interrelated phenomena he was working with, and the concepts and frameworks he brought to them were a kind of ad hoc modelling arising out of his method of double or multiple description, which involved, in part at least, the process of abduction, a term he borrows from Charles Sanders Peirce. Of particular interest here is Bateson's groundbreaking definition of mind and of mental phenomena. For Bateson, mind can be defined as any ongoing ensemble of events and objects which has the appropriate complexity of causal circuits and the appropriate energy relations. Mind is not reducible to the material world, but is immanent to material assemblages as the qualitative patterning of their interrelations, and as the organizational structures that arise from this patterning in feedback loops and in the formation of systems and subsystems which causally affect each other. Crucially, Batesonian mind is always constituted in systems and subsystems, which are not bounded or closed in upon themselves, but which are interconnected across thresholds. Thus, any given human mind is not contained with an individual brain or body, but is always a subsystem of larger systems. We may say that mind is immanent in those circuits of the brain which are complete within the brain, or that mind is immanent in circuits which are complete within the system brain plus body, or finally that mind is immanent in the larger system man plus environment. This, in turn, leads Bateson to the following claim. The individual mind is immanent, but not only in the body. It is immanent also in the pathways and messages outside the body, and there is a larger mind of which the individual mind is only a subsystem. Accordingly, mind for Bateson extends out from bodily subsystems into interrelated social and anthropological systems and subsystems, and also equally into biological, species-based and interspecies systems, all connected and interconnected to the extent that he conventionally can affirm mind is immanent in the total evolutionary structure. It's important to note that mind for Bateson is not consciousness, but rather the qualitative patterning and complexity that organizes the forms and structures of the living. And he excludes physical reality from this, so to this extent he's not exactly a panpsychist. Here, communicational and cybernetic insights are being developed into a holistic account of the living, understood as a series of qualitatively patterned, interactive systems that generate and evolve nested structures that are indeed physical, but as also mental, are not generated from orders of strictly physical causation. It seems important to me to underline that Bateson does not think mind systems as qualitative patterns are determinable. He argues, If the total mind is an integrated network, and if the content of consciousness is only a sampling of different parts and localities in this network, then inevitably the conscious view of the network as a whole is a monstrous denial of the integration of the whole. From the cutting of consciousness, what appears above the surface is arcs of circuits, instead of either complete circuits or larger complete circuits of circuits. This means that wherever something like an instance of conscious mind exists, it exists and does so only ever as a fragment immanently inserted into a wider complex network of systems and subsystems, whose whole or totality it can by definition never grasp. Any such claim to total determinability would be a monstrosity, a treating of consciously identifiable parts as the whole that they can never be. The formal pattern of this model of mind mirrors that of Nancy's sense of the world, its excess, its ungraspability, and similarly mirrors Nancy's invocation of the creative unconscious of the world. Insofar as Bateson views minds as assemblages of events, structures, formal patterns, and interconnected relations, he also sees the systems and subsystems that traverse human individual, social, and cultural life, as well as all life as such, and in its evolutionary processes, as an integrated whole, that necessarily and irreducibly excludes the grasp of human cognition, thought, and knowledge. He writes, beautiful phrase this, I surrender to the belief that my knowing is a small part of a wider integrated knowing that knits the entire biosphere or creation. This implies a contingency, limitation, and situatedness of all knowing, insofar as any conscious mind that can know will necessarily be working at the limits of its own conscious systems and subsystems as they open out onto other systems and subsystems within the wider unknowable whole. Here, the importance of threshold comes to the fore as an epistemological necessity. For any act of knowing, that of an external physical environment in which the biological body or organism finds itself, or that of any system sensing or receiving information from any other system, involves a threshold, an interface, and a moment of reception from the outside. A world of sense organization is not conceivable without discontinuity, without threshold. If sense organs receive news of difference, and if neurons either fire or do not fire, then threshold becomes necessarily a feature of how the living and the mental world is put together. Here, thresholds and limits are immanent structures of the wider structuring of mind itself, demarcating conscious instances of mind from the wider unconscious systems into which they are inserted, and the various regions of mind in their complex, nested, integrated, but irreducibly ungraspable whole. It is here, all too briefly, but nonetheless indispensably, that Juri Lotman's thinking of the semiosphere or of semiospheres in the plural also comes into play. We can immediately remind ourselves that Lotman defines a semiosphere as that synchronic semiotic space which fills the borders of cultures without which separate semiotic systems cannot function or come into being. So natural languages, cultural or social forms and structures all have as their prior condition an anterior world of sense and meaning, of semiosis, or, as Lotman puts it, semiotic experience precedes the semiotic act. We can then note three key aspects of Lotman's semiospheres. One, the semiosphere is marked by its heterogeneity. Two, every culture begins by dividing the world into its own internal space and their external space. And three, because semiotic space is transected by numerous boundaries, each message that moves across it must be many times translated and transformed, and the process of generating information thereby snowballs. The key point here is that any given semiosphere is internally heterogeneous, transected by boundaries which act as thresholds or interfaces across which sense and meaning can only pass in an act of translation or transformation. Necessarily also, any semiosphere will itself be part of a wider semiospheric system, its own boundaries giving onto other semiospheres to which it is related or within which it is nested. In this regard, the formal patterning of Lotman's universe of the mind clearly mirrors that of Bateson's ecology of mind. Although Lotman's semiospheres appear to concern themselves with human cultures and semiotic spaces, he did very late in life concede that anthropological semiotic spaces must necessarily be situated within biological and ecological semiospheres, what Bateson, again after Vernadsky, would call a wider biosphere. In this way, and drawing on the formal similarity of Lotman and Bateson, later biosemioticians such as Klaus Emesch and Kalevi-Kull can imagine an almost exact mapping of semiosphere onto biosphere. They write, biosphere is almost extensive with semiosphere if we take the semiosphere conceptually to subsume the total sphere or network of sign relations or sign processes, the set of relations that compose everything living forms semiosphere. I'm coming to a close now. Here then, Nancy's sense of the world or of worlds, Bateson's biosphere of mind, and Lotman's semiospheres all mirror each other, offer similar formal patterns that model the exotic dispersion of worldly sense, mind, or semiosis across human, biological, and non-human worlds. This, I think, allows for a more precise specification of Nancy's sense of the world and his invocation of the world's creative unconscious. It also allows for a specification of the praxis, ethos, or living disposition vis-à-vis the present that Nancy evokes. For this can now be understood as a praxis and ethos of limit, threshold, and interface that takes place between sense worlds, mind systems, and semiospheres. In his posthumously published work, Anglosphere, Bateson writes that we need to shift our ways of seeing that would affirm the complexities and mutual integration of both sides of any interface. If there is a pragmatic new beginning for politics here, it is one where the sites of opposition, tension, or conflict that can arise within and between political forms are viewed not as oppositions, but rather as sites of interface between sense worlds, mind systems, or semiospheres. Right and left, liberal and conservative, democratic and authoritarian, the West and the non-West, religious and secular, state and society, states and other states, the human and the non-human, the economic and the environmental, and so on. All these can be understood as sites of interface within the wider system, threshold, or interfaces that can, of course, be negotiated in so many different ways, through diplomacy and war, through the making of value demands, competition and self-interest, alliance and mutual benefit, negotiation, non-military conflict and military confrontation, and so on. Here is Bateson one last time. What may be required in this systemic view are, he says, ways of seeing that affirm our own complexity and the systematic complexity of the other, and that propose the possibility that they may constitute an inclusive system, a common network of mind and elements of the necessarily mysterious. Such a perception of self and other is the affirmation of the sacred. Bateson characterizes this way of seeing as an affirmation of the sacred, and I have absolutely no problem with that at all. The ungraspability of the integrated whole, the unconscious of the world. I would conclude by saying that such a way of seeing can also be seen and understood as an experience that can be named but not grasped or determined, an experience of the excessive integrated whole of world sense, of mind, of the biosphere and its multiple interconnected semiospheres. This is an experience that for me now would bear the name of biocommunity. Perhaps such a politics of interface is in fact what politics already is and already has been, always. A living disposition of human organisation with which, parce Nancy, we are already familiar without even knowing it is such. The name of biocommunity here, though, as an experience of the present and its elsewhere, of the world and of a turning out towards all its possible thresholds and interfaces, is not a philosophical principle or ground, but just that, an experience. And the experience of biocommunity is a sharing of finitude and negotiation of thresholds and interfaces in that sharing of finitude is all we have, indeed all we've ever had. Politics and the politics of new beginnings need, I think, to begin at this point. The sharing of finitude at political thresholds and interfaces, in the knowledge that we do indeed act within a necessarily mysterious, inclusive system whose systematic complexity, although ungraspable, can nevertheless bear a name, that of biocommunity, the experience of which is the sole authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Indeed, very convincing, so many things. I was wondering whether you knew the work by Judin Blauberg about the systems theory, where analyzing the systems theory, they juxtapose Marxist dialectics and the Marxist approach to systems and the cybernetic approach to systems. This is the first point, and just departing from this juxtaposition that they make there, I would ask, and maybe this is the question to everyone, as long as we speak about immanences of nature, to what extent, if we have any respect to Marxist tradition, we should treat sociality, nature, and culture isomorphically. And whether there are irreversibilities when we shift to culture to reverse back to nature. So whether there are these affirmative immanences which are characteristic for cybernetic theories and, for instance, for Bateson, and Deconstruction, which already experienced negativity and came to immanence on the new stage of immanence. So my question is, to what extent, having gone through so many revolutionary stages of politics and culture, we can again refer back to technopantheism as if there are no ruptures with it, and as if we can remain in this techno-natural wholeness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Firstly, I don't know the author that you mentioned, and I'm not really a...
I could share.
No, I would be very grateful.
It's an old book.
I'm not, nor would claim to be, an expert on systems theory. I know some of it, Lotman and such like. So I don't know whether this is unique with Bateson, but of course what I was trying to underline and what I value so much is the manner in which he underlines that these systems in which we are inserted are not determinable and not knowable. So a system is something that you're sort of situated with, and you can map and model, but it's that unknowability, that excess of the wider system. Now, I suspect a lot of systems theory is predicated around notions of what's determinable in a system and focusing on what's determinable as a system. So, in Maturana and Veola's autopoiesis theory, there's very much a sense of operative closure of organisms, and that operative closure allows them to determine biologically what's part of the system. And so, for me, and there may be others within systems here who do this, the absolute vital thing is that for Bateson, the total system is indeterminable. You're only ever a fragment. And what he's doing by these processes, starting with anthropological systems, in Bali early on career, working in psychiatry, and then going through biology and all these things, he's always working with the systems that he's negotiating via these processes of abduction and double description. And if one takes abduction from Pearson as it's transformed into Bateson, this is a form of knowing which is always kind of about adopting best hypotheses, about kind of modelling. So it has a very sort of limited epistemological and ontological force. So as he builds through different logical categories, these meta-models, I think they would never be ontological as such. They're certainly epistemological, but have a kind of an inbuilt weak epistemological force, all predicated on this greater mystery. And he relates it to the sacred, he relates it to the name of God, and gives God that name, eco, I've tried to sort of bring that back down to biocommunity. So that's the difference there. And my starting point was Nancy and French deconstruction. For better or for worse, I work within the French tradition. And they all, these people have this very, very specific itinerary in the post-war period. Nancy began as a Christian socialist and disillusioned as a teenager by Hungary in the 50s and everything that unfolded in the 60s. So all this thinking is, in a sense, broadly sympathetic to the Marxian tradition and to the name of community that the term communism might name. From the 80s onwards, with the election of Mitterrand and the kind of the failure of French socialist politics, they're all trying to think of how these fundamental ideas of human solidarity and community that Marx named through his thinking can be rethought in another way. So in a sense, this is necessarily, at best, heterodox to Marx and Marxism, otherwise not really Marxist at all, and for its own reasons.
I would also like to make a very short comment maybe on your last question, Katie, and that's about whether there is a risk of falling into this techno-optimism, right? Yeah. Right. I would maybe comment on it more from a practical political level and like practical political questions, and it's also something I'll be speaking about tomorrow. Well, I almost feel like one of the big questions now is really how would you apply, like, for example, everything you speak about in terms of like practical political action, for example, in order to tackle polycrisis, right? Exactly all of these questions are being discussed now, but the question is also in what kind of political action does it come? And there is a certain risk of, like what you say, of this techno-optimism and like using technology as the overall solution, but I almost feel like, I mean, I would probably call it a second take on the like practical realization of the system theory. If we saw the first one in the like 70s and 80s with the mass spread out of cybernetics at those times, and we saw it being applied then, now I almost feel like there's a next level of this. There's a level which also wants to integrate biological systems. There's a level which also wants to integrate nature ecosystems. There's a level which wants to understand how do we do like management and governance systems within uncertainties, like no clear borders, like you say, like no clear divisions, and with no categories, no taxonomies, and somehow still provide this new very flexible, very fluid systems of governance, right? Which go far beyond this kind of technological, like technology saves us all attitude. So this is what I observe. I don't know if you would
answer that bit of the question. So thanks for bringing it back. I mean, across these French thinkers, obviously Heidegger's critique of technology is very, very present. They critique that critique.
Sorry, can you speak into the microphone?
Yes.
I've been
so
talking.
Nancy has a very interesting thinking of a kind of an originary techne, the techne of sense, the sense of the world, what he calls ecotechnicity. And it goes actually perhaps less back towards Heidegger than it does towards Georges Canguilhem in essays like Machine et Organisme, where human technology is seen actually as a kind of an excrescence of an originary technicity of biological life. So human technology sort of grows out of this originary biological technicity. And so this isn't instrumental rationality. This isn't the kind of thing that Heidegger critiques. As kind of an originary techne, Nancy would say, of sense, it precedes that instrumental rationality. And what it means is that we need, as thinkers, to find techniques that sidestep instrumental rationality, extractive technologies, and this is a bit Heideggerian, that sort of step back into a remodeling of the techniques of thought. So that is a very big question that, from Stiegler to Derrida to Nancy, is there. Yeah, thank you.
Contemporary scholarship is really into the problem of soul, from what I can see. But I was sitting and thinking, standing and thinking about the possible political applications of this, like what could this all mean Politically, this was always my question to Nancy too, because these are like meta-political points, but is there a practical component? So in politics, this obviously corresponds to the public sphere, which you didn't mention, and which is maybe better developed in this country than in France. But this is an important and lively part of our contemporary polity and contemporary public law discussions. And of course, everything that you said means that to maintain a public sphere, the soul of the community, it's not enough to have like rules of deliberation or something, but there must be some strange source of this discussion actually making sense, having a meaning, having existential meaning. I mean, even Habermas understands this. There is an existential component to the genuine communication. But then the second aspect of my comment is that, okay, well, if this is a public sphere, and if generally we are talking about spheres, and Oksana was talking about this like basically sphere, Umwelt, etc., then it must be void, right? There must be something that must keep it pure. So it seems that you are talking about the need for maintaining a vacuum or a vacuole somewhere in the society, which means the need for a very serious negative effort of cleaning everything substantive from there. Again, this is the task of the ecology of mind, right? But as I mentioned in the morning, it's a great idea. I also see a lot of dangers there. And one is basically clericalization, and this last slide is very telling, because in order to keep this void, basically you have to protect it. You have to keep something secret, hidden. Then it's void. That could be one way. And then you have to delimit it, protect from the outside, from the foreign agents, so that actually they don't penetrate this vacuole. Very important. I don't know how you can do without this.
Yep. Thank you for this, Ian. A wonderful talk, but much as I'm trying, I cannot recognize traits of Nancy's thinking in resonance with Bateson and Lotman. In fact, it seems to me that Nancy is saying the exact opposite, because there is no space for exscription in the integration of systems. In fact, a system is a word that Nancy really grapples with and grapples against, as you well know. In operativity, it's all about an operationalization and making operative. So I see the exact opposite effect here, except for this necessarily mysterious part where the finitude that Nancy is talking about becomes an epistemic finitude. When Nancy is talking about finite thinking, he's not really talking about a cognitive or, let's say, Kantian limits to human understanding. He's really talking about a finitude in a much more existential sense of the term. And I don't see this present here. In fact, I see all of this as a kind of an attempt to erase what Nancy calls finitude and all of these gaps that cannot be covered over with interfaces, in a way. So I wonder how you deal with it.
Thank you very much. And when we talk about network and when we talk about bio-community, I feel that there is a gap there because, and there's also a kind of human privilege there about which we never talk about, in the sense that a tree right now is not discussing here with us. And there are certain things that, for example, here to my mind comes Leroy Gurham, who says that humans are in a certain way without territory because we always adapt to all kinds of territories. We live in the most cold places and in the most hot places, and we go to cosmos. And I can be a bird by flying in the airplane, and I can swim like a fish if I go into I don't know, ship down below there. And so there is a certain also semiotic freedom that we possess by discussing what we're discussing now. So how is it that I feel that we cannot speak about networks and communities without also taking a certain responsibility? And here comes to mind Heidegger with caring, and something that feminism also like takes a lot today. Yeah, but I feel there is a lot of need in actually thinking about what is the mysterious then there, and what is caring in the what are we talking about when we talk about mysterious, sacred, in connection to these problems of superiority, kind of. Because I maybe not be superior to a dolphin because I cannot have an echolocation, but I am superior to a dolphin because I'm discussing with you right now. Maybe, but maybe it's not a superiority, it's a difference. It's just a radical difference between us. So what?
Yeah, please, please go.
Hard to be quick with all the great questions, so I'll do my best.
Into the mic, please.
So, political applications. I mean, the talk I've given today is the beginning of a new project, which is why I was so pleased that it sort of tallies with the idea of new beginnings. The question that you put to Nancy, so did I and colleagues, there was always this problem. On the one hand, he gave us this thinking of community, and on the other hand, he was always sort of blocking this passage from philosophy to politics. And it was sort of frustrating because you wanted to kind of push him, and I'm still, rest in peace, I'm still trying to do that. And I would say that in the model I was trying to put forward, a threshold or a limit is not a negative, is not a void. I mean, I think, Nancy doesn't use the word immanence in the way that Bateson does. He's not Deleuze, where I see actually not much scope for experiences of limits and thresholds. For me, Nancy is a thinker, as a finite thinker, of limits. And these limits are ontological, they can be epistemological, we'll come to that. But they are always encountered and experienced as such. But it's always an opening on, a touch at a distance. And I think he's similar to Deleuze in the sense that there's an attempt to expel the negative from thought. So insofar as there's a Heideggerian sort of moment there, it's carried through into an idea of groundlessness. And his work on Kant in the 80s, there's very much a sense that once the ground is gone, what you get is not a void, but a dispersion of existence in the absence of ground. And this creates an experience of multiplicity, of being singular plural, but of thresholds which are always about the touching in distance of another. So I don't see that we could talk a lot about this, because I can see where your question is coming from, and it's a legitimate point to raise. But to me, the key thing is that a threshold and a limit is not an experience of negativity, and it's an exposure to another order of sense that's in excess of what you can calculate. So we'll do that for now. Partially, I accept what you say. One of the things about what I'm trying to do here, and sort of slightly taking a cue from Bateson and his idea of a double or multiple description, is that in aligning and seeing formal patterns of similarity between different, in this case, discourses, the claim is not that they're the same, but that there are similarities and differences, and out of patterns of similarity to build a sort of a higher level of interpretation. So I would say that, just to repeat what I said a minute ago, that in Nancy, a finite thinking is definitely an experience of existence. But also in his thinking of art, we find that a presentation, actually, whether it be philosophical presentation, talks a lot about art and aesthetic presentation. The experience of the limit there is I think the distinction between the epistemological and the ontological collapses. So I would say that the alignment between Nancy and Bateson comes precisely with the bit that you identified, and I would identify back with what you term the essential hiddenness that cannot be done away with, beautiful phrase. The alignment between them comes at the point where there is an order of sense organisation, which creates a multiplicity of worlds, which we encounter through the thresholds with those other worlds that are not our own. These are at once epistemological thresholds, but they're also rooted back into the finitude of what one might call, under erasure, being. So I think, yes, I'm sure you're right that there are very key differences. I'm not trying to collapse these together, and of course one thing I didn't speak about much, and I apologise, was Juri Lotman. I have more to say about him, and I hope to say more in the future. So I'll leave that there for now. And then very quickly, trees. There's the question that Heidegger poses is, you know, we're exclusive as humans as posing the question of being. You know, animals are world poor, and we only have this privilege. So we can pose all these questions. The tree is not discussing with us, and there is an idea that you get in Stiegler that human technicity and technology involves a certain break, that humans have a way of doing technology, that even, you know, the anteaters who stick sticks or their nose, or crows use tools, etc. So the question I think that you posed speaks to me around the question of human exceptionalism, and whether we are not already sort of still in that, or whether one has to, perhaps should be in that. And the way the model I'm putting forward deals with that is to suggest, yes, of course, this is a human model, and only a human discourse could come up with this kind of modelling. But it's a kind of and I move away from, you know, quasi-transcendentalism onto the train of Bateson's thinking of immanence, which is that these models are, if you like, they're part of the immanent systems which are ungraspable. They're inserted immanently into them. So yes, I can't speak for the tree, nor can the tree speak back, but all of humanity is an extension of this natural world into which the human is inserted. And I would say, I could rehearse this at length, I don't think the humans are actually human. By which I mean, when we think about the human, we always have a metaphysical idea of what the human is or is not, that usually excludes something that's the not human. Actually, there's an inhuman within the human which we cannot grasp. You know, that the system human is something that is likewise hidden and mysterious. So the whole question that Heidegger brings to this about humans being the only people who can pose the question of being as such, or the technological exceptionalism of the human, kind of collapses if you think of technology as an immanent excrescence of a prior techniques of nature, or if you think of the human semiotic system as an excrescence of a biosemiotic system. All this is always folded back and immanent too, and just weakly modelling the very thing in which it collapses back into, which will always be a mystery. And you know, if you're on the secular side, you could do a Bateson and still be materialist. If you're on the religious side, you can name it, and that's another interface. So that's as far as I can go with that. I hope it kind of answers your question. There are no